Finding Little Mountain on the horizon can be a challenge. Here is a view of Little Mountain from the intersection of Route 44 and Route 2, looking toward the south, one of the few places where the hill stands out on the horizon. Little Mountain is a low, 1 mile long, L-shaped hill that straddles the county line between Lake and Geauga counties. A flat-lying layer of conglomerate, a sedimentary rock that looks similar to concrete, forms an erosion-resistant cap on the top of the hill. The flanks of the hill consist of shale, a much weaker rock. The tortuous blue line on the map depicts the many twists and turns of the Little Mountain Interpretive Trail. Note the closely spaced brown contour lines that surround the three peaks or knobs that define an inverted L-shaped hill. The northwest and southwest peaks are on Holden property, and they're shown in green. The eastern peak is on private property. The areas shown in light brown depict conservation easements that have been negotiated between the Holden Arboretum and neighbors whose land borders Holden property. The terms of the agreements limit development and tree cutting, thereby insulating Holden's fragile ecosystems from invasive species and lawn chemicals associated with residential neighborhoods. Here is a colored relief topographic map of Little Mountain from Google Maps showing its location relative to Interstate 90 to the north, the East Branch of the Chagrin River to the west, and Stebbins Gulch to the south. The low-lying areas are shown in green, and the topographically higher areas are shown in dark orange. The three knobs that form the inverted L stand out clearly on the map. Little Mountain is part of an upland divide that separates the East Branch Chagrin River watershed to the west from the Grand River watershed to the east. Here is one of the few spots in Lake and Geauga counties where Little Mountain stands out above the horizon. The telephoto image was taken in Holden's conifer collection facing north near the main entrance on Kirtland Chardon Road. The dark green crowns of towering 200 to 300-year-old eastern white pines and eastern hemlocks stands out on the distant ridgeline, contrasting with the deciduous trees surrounding them. Before we scoff at the notion of calling this low hill a mountain, we should remember that early settlers walked the ground or rode horses everywhere they went. They had a much better feel for topography than modern people, effortlessly crossing hill and dale in their automobiles. Little Mountain is a climactic, botanical, topographic, and geologic outlier. Almost everything about this unusual area points to the far north. Some features are obvious, like the mature white pines and hemlocks on the summit. Others are subtle, like the unusual soils, rare wildflowers, and birds that nest here and stay all summer instead of migrating to Canada. Deep snows occasionally bridge deep, narrow crevasses like the one shown here, making it imperative to stay on the marked trails. Little Mountain is one of the snowiest places in Ohio. It averages as much as 110 inches of snowfall a year compared to just over 50 inches at Cleveland Hopkins Airport, just an hour's drive to the west. Two factors combine to create heavy snows on the mountain. First, an average elevation of over 1,200 feet above mean sea level, and second, its location on the edge of the Portage Escarpment at the northern edge of the Allegheny Plateau, exposing the peak to moisture-laden winds blowing across Lake Erie. The deep, narrow crevasses fringing the mesa-like hilltop have attracted hikers and nature lovers since the 1830s. With temperatures at least 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding areas, with snowpack that can persist until June, the narrow alleys harbor unusual ferns, mosses, and wildflowers that are more characteristic of upstate New York or New England than Ohio. The vertical walls and overhangs are favored nesting sites for birds like northern juncos and eastern phoebes. To avoid stressing them during the nesting season, visitors are allowed to peek inside the crevasses, but they can't hike through them. This photo, taken on Little Mountain, shows three-leaf goldthread, an inconspicuous, easily overlooked evergreen perennial plant of damp, shady habitats and acidic soils. Its range includes the higher Appalachians, New England, Canada, Greenland, and Alaska, where it is listed as endangered in some areas due to loss of habitat. Its common name refers to the long golden yellow underground stems called rhizomes. Also known as cankerroot, Native Americans and early settlers chewed the rhizomes to relieve mouth sores. Its scientific name, Coptis grenlandica, hints of its preference for cold, northern climates. Edge effect occurs whenever a disturbed or unnatural system borders a natural system. For example, where a highway, soybean field, housing development, or Gulf fairway borders on a mature forest. As a result of new housing construction on adjacent private land, carefully manicured backyards are now bordering on Holden's natural areas at Little Mountain. Edge effect is somewhat of a misnomer. The affected areas are actually a wide zone extending into the forest, allowing sunlight and wind to penetrate the woodland, changing the air temperature, humidity, and soil moisture. The altered environmental conditions encourage the growth of opportunistic species such as Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, glossy buckthorn, grasses, and shrubs. Brown-headed cowbirds, blue jays, crows, and house cats are attracted to the zone, threatening the eggs and hatchlings of native woodland birds. Holden's property at Little Mountain consists of a number of narrow, interconnected rectangles, resulting in a high perimeter-to-area ratio that magnifies edge effect. The pinkish-purple area on this map shows the area affected by harmful edge effect given two worst-case scenarios. First, a 200-meter edge effect penetration zone, about 670 feet, and second, lack of any negotiated conservation easements so that all adjacent private land is eventually developed as residential or commercial areas. In the worst case, the entire preserve is overwhelmed by edge effect. Fortunately, the worst theoretical case shown here is not the actual case at Little Mountain, thanks to the generous landowners and Holden's determination to protect this unique site. This map shows the best-case scenario created when Holden's staff and thoughtful landowners successfully negotiated conservation easements restricting future development and tree clearing on the edges of the reserve. It also assumes a narrower 100-meter edge effect, probably more accurate for Lake County, the wettest county in Ohio. The inclusion of private lands under conservation easements, shown cross-hatched in brown, will buffer the interior of the reserve from edge effect degradation so that the areas shown in green will remain pristine. This map reflects the situation today at Little Mountain thanks to the wise stewardship by Holden staff and concerned landowners. Invasive species are non-native plants and animals introduced by humans into a native habitat either by accident or deliberately for landscaping or agricultural purposes. A good example is the landscape plant shown here, English ivy, recently escaped from a lawn bordering on Holden's Little Mountain Reserve and now overwhelming the herbaceous layer of the forest. Invasive species outcompete, outreproduce, and crowd out native species. They can take over large tracts of habitat, altering the food web and drastically reducing native biodiversity. This photo shows 3 native species and 1 invasive species competing for space on a single tree trunk. The native vines are poison ivy, Virginia creeper, and greenbrier, which is on the other side of the tree trunk. The invasive plant is English ivy that has escaped from a bordering yard. In all likelihood, the English ivy will ultimately prevail and crowd out the competing native species. Problems like these can be avoided by choosing native plants for landscaping applications whenever possible, and by making sure that rapidly spreading landscape plants, especially non-natives, are isolated from nearby native habitats. Before 1900, 4 billion large American chestnuts, from 2 to 10 feet in diameter and up to 150 feet in height, ranged from Maine and southern Ontario to Mississippi. As many as 1 in 4 trees growing in the wild in Appalachia were American chestnuts. The nuts were a vital food source for white-tailed deer, wild turkey, passenger pigeons, and black bears. Humans treasured the edible sweet nuts both domestically and as a commercial crop. The hard, straight-grained, rot-resistant wood was the chief U.S. source of tannin for curing leather. It was widely used to build log cabins, frame houses, barns, flooring, split rail fences, and furniture. Today there are less than 100 trees with trunks in excess of 2 feet in diameter within its former range. The culprit was the alien Asian bark fungus, Cryphonectra parasitica, accidentally imported to the U.S. on Chinese chestnuts planted at the Bronx Zoo in 1904. Near the southernmost extent of the trail loop, we begin to see a non-native invasive species once used as an ornamental landscape plant and ground cover for the hotels and cottages on the mountain. The plants we see today are descendants of those planted in the 1800s and early 1900s. Native to Europe and known by a variety of names such as periwinkle, myrtle, creeping myrtle, and vinca, this crawling member of the dogbane family can sprout roots wherever it touches the ground and can grow equally well in full sun or deep shade. It now covers acres of the forest floor, crowding out native wildflowers. Attempts have been made to eradicate it on Little Mountain by spraying and hand pulling, but it still persists over large areas.